Hey guys, what's up? iPenguinPat here, and today we are working on part 2 of the Growth Hacker's Guide to Forge of Empires. And this specific topic is going to be about focusing on forge points versus attack and other military buildings, especially with respect to great buildings. Now, my previous video, which was about forge point per day collection being overrated, got a lot of different comments, and a lot of players were completely on board and saw my point of view with respect to the end game, where you've already leveled up all your buildings and whatnot, and you're able to do lots of fights in guild battlegrounds. But the argument was made that for a newer player, it doesn't make sense to go with the military buildings because you you need the forge points to level your buildings, and that by going with military buildings first, you slow down your growth. And generally speaking, I I don't know that I completely agree with that. And this has been a back and forth discussion with a lot of players. Now, one thing that I always try to keep in mind, and that you might also keep in mind too, is that when people are leaving comments, they're basing it on their own personal experience. And I like to put my resume up against that experience because, frankly, if you've never led a number one guild, started a number one guild, been part of a truly competitive environment, then whatever it is that you're doing doesn't match up with what I'm teaching. My goal is to help players get from starting to being able to fight at a competitive level as quickly as possible so they contribute to their guild in battlegrounds and in GVG, which are the two things that affect guild ranking the most. Now, generally speaking, most players are not leaders of number one guilds, so there's only so much weight that I put on their comments. However, this gentleman named KronikPillow happens to be one of the leaders of Lords of War, and we have had a long history of discussion really since my channel started, starting all the way back when I said that I thought that Cape was not an optimal building to build early on in the game. And his perspective is that's not the case. Now, I am serious when I say he is part of a major guild. Here you can see Lords of War has been number one for nearly 1,500 days. That's a significant amount of time. So they know a little bit about what it takes to be number one. And as you can see, their record is quite good. I think he had to take a little bit of time off for real life, so he's not in the guild right now. But generally, he is. If you look at his player profile, KronikPillow is a main leader in Lords of War. So his point of view is a perspective that I think is valuable and should be listened to because he knows what it takes. And if you're not familiar and you haven't heard me talk about the Lord of War Advanced Guide, this is actually one of the most inspirational pieces of content for me as a player because when I first started playing back in August of 2017, I basically learned much about the game from this guide, and I consider it to be one of the main reasons why I was able to grow so much faster than most other players. And I've hoped that my channel has helped to kind of be the next step of what this guide is. And at this point, this guide is a little bit outdated. As you can see here, it says this guide is up to date through mid-oceanic future, and it hasn't been updated in, let's see, since, well, those are grammar corrections. So, I mean, realistically, it hasn't been updated since early 2017, which that leaves a lot of room for things to have changed. And in the notes, they specifically say that that keep in mind that if a new powerful great building or new feature comes out, it can completely change the game the way that ARC or GE did. And what I am here to tell you is that there have been enough changes and the power creep has increased so much that some of the things that Lord of War was teaching, I don't believe that to necessarily be the optimal path anymore. And let me give some of the examples of things that have changed. As of when this was written, there was no guild battlegrounds, there was no antique dealer, and there were no settlements. And the rewards from special events were not nearly as good. I mean, they were not even close to as good. At the time of the writing of this, I think the winter set was like the last thing that came out, and like cherry sets and palace sets were the best things that were available in the game at that time, which now those things have been power crept out of even usefulness for the most part. I mean, the cherry set you still see, but you barely see palace sets anymore because there's so many things that are significantly better. So KronikPillow has written up a guide, and I'm blacking out most of this. I'm only going to show the part where he recommends the path, because I want to compare using some analytical data about the path that Lord of War recommends versus the path that FoElite recommends, and kind of explain that there are cases where the Lord of War approach still makes more sense for a player, and there are cases where the FoElite approach makes more sense for a player. And with KronikPillow's permission, I will put a link to this guide in the description below. But as of right now, all I'm going to show you is the efficient growth path that they recommend, because I think that's I'm just trying to be respectful of that. And last thing is that for my end of side, for my side of things, what is my optimal recommended path? And here I have in my spreadsheets, this is the rough order of great buildings that I recommend. But generally speaking, I recommend only getting these to like 4 or 5, and really focusing on getting your arc to 80. That is like the main goal that you should have in your entire existence of the game when you first start, is getting your arc to 80, because until your arc is 80, you're not even playing the same game as all the top players. You can't even imagine how different the game is if you have never experienced what it's like to have the power of a fully leveled arc. So, and then kind of expanding off of that, I've come down to this list of great buildings at the levels noted there. And yes, I realize that I used acronyms. You can scroll back up here and kind of compare to figure out what matches up if you're not familiar with the acronyms. I'm sorry for new players. I'm not going to retype that because I'm just out of time. So what I did with this crazy spreadsheet is I put my list of great buildings of what I consider to have developed a player into being a full fighting machine. And frankly, you really could cut off the HC, the castle, Hamaji Castle, I don't know how to say it, and the Innovation Tower. You could arguably cut those out, which I'll get into it later, but generally speaking, cutting those out actually skews the data even more on the direction in favor of my approach. But I'm going to leave those in for the sake of this. And then this one over here is the list in order based off of the guide that I showed you a minute ago. And here you can see I numbered them and then sorted them. And the next column is what the cost would be to level each of those great buildings to the designated level using 1.9. Now, my whole argument and my whole case is that when the Lord of War guide and approach was done, the majority of your forge points came from your great buildings, and it was very difficult to rapidly increase the amount of forge points that you were producing without increasing the forge points that you were getting from your great buildings, with an exception of arc. Sniping, since the arc has come out, sniping has always been the most efficient and fastest way to make a ton of forge points. But aside from that, great buildings were where it was at. But due to power creep and battlegrounds and level 2 of expedition, where you can get terrace farms that give you 12 forge points and all of these things, what the case that I'm making is that you don't necessarily need those great buildings to increase your forge point income enough to rapidly level your other buildings. And if you've seen my other videos about Blue Galaxy and Cape, the case that I make against those is that by leveling your Cape or leveling your Blue Galaxy, you don't break even for at least 200 days, or in the case of Blue Galaxy, 300 or 400 days or whatever it is. There's a lot of variables for the Blue Galaxy. But the bottom line is that simply by leveling this building alone, you're already setting yourself back a certain number of days before it pays for itself. And that is the part that throws me off, and that's the part where I guess there's some discrepancy. So let's continue moving forward. So the next thing that I did was I said I would really like to be at my pinnacle goal or my baseline goal, steady state goal within 1 year. So how many forge points per day on average would I need to reach the FoElite goal, and how many forge points per day on average would I need to get to reach the Lord of War goal? And here you can see that the FoElite you need to average 400 and we'll call it 480 compared to 710 for the Lord of War. So you have to average a pretty significant amount more, about 220 extra forge points per day on average. And that's, that's definitely doable to reach that point. Using the models and metrics that were provided by KronikPillow in his guide, he started with a baseline saying, okay, say that the player's average daily forge point production was 200 forge points. So I have that there. How long will it take at a 200 forge point daily average to hit these numbers? All right, that was the next thing I was looking at. And if you're looking at just that specifically, the FoElite does actually take almost 100 days longer to complete than the Lord of War. Now, I'm going to take a step back because I realize I left a little bit out. How did I calculate this days to complete the Lord of War prescription plus the FoElite minimum requirements? And what I did here, you can see with my formula, is I started with the amount to level the arc, and then I divided it by our daily average, and then I did the amount for cape, and I divided it by the daily average plus the amount extra that you would be getting from the cape. Now, this kind of smudges some things because on one hand, I'm not factoring double dips, but on the other hand, I am actually crediting this method as getting the full forge point benefit from level 1. So even I'm saying that you're getting 70 extra forge points per day or whatever, even when you're at level 1 or level 2 or level 5 or level 30 or whatever it is. And doing that is basically to try to help offset all of the other variables. I figured it was better to just overestimate the amount that you were getting as opposed to trying to come up with the double dips and the whatever. And I use this method all the way down. So here with the Innovation Tower, my recommendation is to going to 60. There, the Lord of War says 70. So there's a 6 forge point difference. So when you come over here to this, you can see that I added that extra amount in. And then for these here, starting at Blue Galaxy and going down, since all of these, the only extra amount of forge points that you're getting is that extra 78, I add the 70 plus the 6 plus the 39, the 44, and the 78 to give you that full extra amount plus the daily average for the remaining pieces. My algebra teacher is probably singing in glory because I actually applied algebra to something in this game. So here you can see I have really made an effort to give these a fair shake and say, what is going to get us to have a steady state fighter as quickly as possible? Because to me, that's the goal of developing a player and getting them to be a productive member in your guild. All right, so here you can see that based on a 200 forge point a day average, the Lord of War is clearly better. The Lord of War approach gives you roughly 240 more forge points per day once you complete the process. So even if you were to be at the break-even point, which is at 280 forge points a day, and yes, I did some crazy algebra to figure out what that actual number was. So if you average 280 forge points a day, either method you would reach in roughly the same amount of time. However, the Lord of War approach is still better in this scenario because when you reach that point, you're going to be making an extra 240 forge points a day. So that's a pretty significant difference, right? That means that moving forward past that, you would still be doing a lot better. Now, fast forward again and say, all right, what if I'm trying to accomplish this goal and I'm trying to do it within a year? and I'm going to use the FoE Elite version of this. I want to hit this within a year. Well, that requires you to do 477 forge points a day. And at that point, if that's the average that you're making, you will actually become a fully developed fighter 53 days faster using the FoE Elite approach than you will the Lord of War approach. And here's where I'm going with this, and I'm going to keep doing some more numbers, but keep this in mind as you look at these numbers. As more of your forge points come from other sources and less percentage of your forge points are coming from your great buildings, the better the FoE Elite approach gets. Let me say that again, because it's really important to understand. The more forge points that you produce from your great buildings, the higher percentage of forge points that you're producing from your great buildings, the better the Lord of War approach is. The more forge points that you produce, excluding your great buildings, the better the FoE Elite approach is. Okay, so let's keep moving forward. This 477 forge points a day average, what does that look like? What does that take? What does this even mean? I did some rough smudging of numbers of what it would take to get to these amounts, right? Like what does a player's growth look like? How many forge points are they making? Yada, yada, yada. Oh, I am going to circle up on one other quick thing just for calculation purposes. On the Blue Galaxy level 55, what I did with that one is I based that off of having a level 55 Blue Galaxy and having an average of 10 forge points per charge, like for the building itself. So basically what that means is that all the buildings that you have, you've got like a bunch of crow's nest and a fully maxed out Yggdrasil and terrace farm level 2s and things like that, so that your Blue Galaxy is really giving you the best that you can get. Now, if you don't have all that stuff and like you're collecting mostly just level 1 terrace farms and Olympic treasuries or Colossus or things like that, where you're only getting 4 or 5 forge points per charge, well, at that point, this FP number goes down significantly. Okay, so that is something that is important to keep in mind, is that I also was relatively generous for the Blue Galaxy, and that I find it questionable that you would be able to have an average of 10 forge points per charge as a early on player. Now, if you've been playing for a year or more, then you've probably developed enough buildings to get close to that if that's been your focus. But if that hasn't been your focus, that's not necessarily an easy goal to hit. So for these calculations, I just did some real smudging quick numbers. Let's say the average average max attrition that you can fight to, based on the great buildings there, is 40. Oh, and I left out a couple other things between the FoE Elite method and the Lord of War method. So first is that I focus on getting the chateau first. And the reason why this is important is because it allows you to remove goods buildings and to remove housing and to remove supply buildings, which means that you can put in more barracks so that you can fight more, and it lets you put in attack buildings, and it lets you put in more forge point producing buildings for that matter, right? You don't have to compromise in what's in your city. You can be as efficient as possible. So that also means that you'll be doing more recurring quests, because you'll have the cascading effect of you get the coins, and then the coins completes the coins recurring quest, and let's not forget that you do get forge points as a reward for doing those things with the chateau. So that is actually a forge point producing building in a sense. It's not a direct thing, and calculating it is wildly difficult. That doesn't mean that it's not producing extra forge points for you. And then the second thing is that I pushed that Traz up front way sooner than the Lord of War approach. Here with the Lord of War approach, it is like the 10th building down, right? If you say you started with a level 10 Traz, there's not that much fighting you can do with a level 10 Traz. At some point, if nothing else, even if you have the units, they're all going to get damaged. Like, I know people with level 60 Trazes that end up running out of units to fight with because they're all damaged. Not because they're dead, but just because they're all damaged and they don't want to lose all their units because they're damaged, right? Especially when you're aging up and things like that. Having that higher level TRAS lets you age up more quickly, whereas having to wait for all these other buildings to pay for themselves before you get to your TRAS, that slows down how quickly you're able to really dive into battlegrounds. And frankly, it also makes it so that you can't start contributing in the lower ages in GVG if that's your game. Okay, so back to this other calculation. So here I'm saying max attrition of 40. I know from my secondary world on Norsel, I can fight to about 40 attrition with my great buildings, my Traz, Zeus, COA, CDM, and TA, all at level 10. My attack is basically like 100. It's like 100, 100 or something like that. It's not very good. In Contemporary, I was able to fight to 40 pretty consistently. Starting at about 30 attrition, I had to at least go into the fight, skip a turn, and then auto battle. And also you have to watch out for the 8 tanks. But otherwise, fighting to 40 attrition is definitely not out of the question, especially if you're good at figuring out matchups. Here, I put an average of basically 2 siege camps approximately. And down here, that tells you that you would be making roughly, and this is in Diamond League, roughly 136 forge points a day, whereas with the Lord of War, you're only making about 70 forge points a day. Keep in mind that if you're in a really developed guild that has plenty of fights available, this number can go way higher, like way, way higher. Most days, I only jump on for literally 1 round of flips, and that's it. And I can usually pound out about 100 fights in about 5 or 10 minutes, and that's just 1 round of flips. And say your guild is flipping 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. Now, it really kind of depends on the guild that you're on and the server that you're on and the layout of the battlegrounds map and what towers are available and all that. There's a lot of variables. So over the course of a season, there might be a season where you end up getting pinned in your headquarters, and there might be a season where you are working with all allies and you are flipping every 5 hours and you get a zillion fights. So obviously there's major variation in what you're getting from battlegrounds, but I'm just going to keep it simple and say max of 40 attrition with a 2 siege camp bonus on average. Here, of course, we have our 24-hour forge point counter. I put 10 for taverns. Who knows? I mean, if you're not good at taverning, if you don't have friends that have the red or burgundy or whatever tablecloth, then that's not going to get you 10, but whatever. Here we've got the great building amounts that come from our various great building recommendations. Sniping. Now, this is a big one. And I'll tell you why it's a big one. Because 200 a day from sniping is damn near nothing. Like, literally, that's almost nothing. One, if you have a level 80 arc and you snipe a level 50 arc at 50%, right? So like half, right? Just a standard traditional snipe, you're going to make 180 to 200 forge points off of that one singular snipe. Now, if you multiply that across several players or several buildings, this number could easily jump up a lot. And if you have watched my video on how to make a ton of forge points and you do some guild hopping, especially when you're first getting rolling and you have first gotten your level 80 arc and you're trying to get your other buildings up and going, that guild hopping, even for like a week or two, heck, even for the 3 days between battlegrounds and whatnot, you could go like from your main guild to, if your guild has a sister guild or a partner guild or whatever, you can guild hop for the 3 days from the end of battlegrounds to the start of the next battlegrounds, and then snipe all the buildings that you guild hopped between. Making 1,000 a day is not really as hard as it sounds. It really isn't. And I've had people in my comments say that they are making like 2 and 3 and 4 and 5,000 forge points a day sniping, and I don't doubt that at all. Like, I don't doubt it one bit. Okay, but I'm going to go back to 200 a day, which if you can't make 200 a day sniping, then you're not a competitive player, and this isn't going to help you. All right, now special collection, and what that means is those are just the buildings that you have, right? Those are your abandoned asylums and your trains and your colosseums, or no, not colosseum, colossuses, and other buildings like that, right? Your House of Horrors, yada yada yada. And since I used the Blue Galaxy saying that there were at least 13 or 14 buildings that were doing at least 10 forge points each on average, I figured that 80 was a fair amount. And then also your town hall, if you're in a high level guild, that's going to add on to it. So here you could see that 760 forge points a day at the end of this goal here is not that hard to get to. It really isn't that hard to get to. So point being that it's really not hard to make this number of 477 forge points a day. That's really not that difficult. So let's continue on with this. How does this play out in the long run? Now, say you are making this 477 forge points a day. That means that you get to your goal 53 days faster than in the Lord of War approach. Well, yes, I'm not making that extra 240 forge points, but I also have an extra 53 days to make forge points to make up for that. And that's what this time difference weight is basically saying, okay, well, with this extra 53 days, well, I'm going to make 40,000 forge points. So with those 40,000 forge points, if I want to come back and level my cape and finish leveling my Inno, and then I don't know what other building I would level from this. I don't think there's anything else here I would level. And then whatever it is, So say you wanted to come back and level your cape and level your Inno. I wouldn't do the Hujia. We'll go from there. Then boom. Now you can catch up on this if you want to, right? Now you don't have to, but you could. At that point, the difference gets even smaller and slimmer and whatnot. So point being is that there is a major advantage of getting to this point more quickly. Now to circle back up on a comment I made earlier in the video, how taking out the HC and the Inno from my approach actually ends up helping you to, or actually makes it so that you reach your end goal even faster. I just going to show that I'm not BSing when I say that, because the HC in my plan, the FoElite plan, is really a luxury thing, and it's not really required. It's just that the supplies, especially the amount of supplies that you get, is just so overpowered in the earlier ages. It lets you do more recurring quests and things like that, but it is by no means necessary at all, and it actually adds a lot of extra time into hitting the baseline goal. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and take out the forge point cost and the forge point gain from having the HC, but I'm going to add the extra forge points to the Lord of War. And notice that when I add this in, it cuts down the amount of time to complete over here for the Lord of War. And even with that said, it makes it so that I'm able to hit the rest of these goals in a significantly less amount of time. Before, I believe we were looking at about 53 days, and now we're looking at about 90 days. So having that HC actually is a huge difference. It's almost a 40-day difference, right? That is a really big difference. And in fact, when you take that out, it ends up making the weighted time difference skew way more over into our direction. Granted, it also cuts the amount of forge points here, so if we're going to do the full cascading effect. So there we go, time weighted difference. So time weighted difference says that there's almost 67,000 extra forge points that I can make up in those 90 days of time, right? And not only that, like I said, that cuts off from a actual, from day one time, that cuts off almost 60 days from how long it takes versus having the HC in there. So that's a really big deal. And then the same thing, let's take the Inno out. Let's just see what happens when we take the Inno out. All right, so here we take that off and we add those 36 over here. And oh, look, we cut the time down even more, right? Now we're down to 280 days versus here, we're talking about 99 days faster. That's 100 days fast. That's more than 3 months faster, right? If you take out, so realistically, using the plan that I recommend, you are actually hitting your peak fighting capacity, or not your peak, but your sustainable fighting capacity almost 3 months faster than the Lord of War approach. And at that point, it really does start adding up a lot. It starts making a really big difference as to how much extra fighting you're doing from Battlegrounds and how much extra you're able to contribute in other areas of the game like GVG. All right. So the next thing is that yes, we have talked about what can happen hypothetically here. Yes, you can hypothetically make this 477 forge points a day, but how realistic is that? Is that something that you can do? Well, I happen to have my FoE manager save from, you see here, this is roughly a year and 10 days into my game playing experience. And the nice thing about this is that I can come in and you can look and you can see the level of all of my great buildings and where they're at. And keep in mind that this was in 2018, which means that the best buildings that were available were things like the pirate ship, which has been power crept and is total garbage now, and the Grand Bridge, which has been power crept and is total garbage now, and the winter set, which has been power crept and is total garbage now. Are you seeing the trend here? Like, a lot of the stuff in my city has been power crept and is total garbage. Also, if you look at my city, the types of buildings that I have after a year are not nearly as good as what you would have after a year if you were to be playing now. You would have a lot more Statue of Honors available to you. You would have a lot more things from the antique dealer and from the settlement and all these things. So this is my collection just from special buildings was not very impressive with this city. So I did what any iPenguinPat would do. I plugged in my great buildings into my handy dandy spreadsheet. I figured out what it would cost to level those great buildings to the levels that were noted. I got my total amount, and then I figured out how many forge points per day did it take to get there. And it took an average of 613 forge points per day. Let's go back over here, 613 forge points a day. That means that I was able to get to my recommended goal almost 2 months faster. Almost 2 months faster. Like, that's a lot faster. That's kind of a big deal, right? I mean, we're looking at like just a little over 9 months from start to being at the FoElite thing. Now, of course, the extra months, the extra 3 months or whatever, those were necessary to pay for all of the research and all of that stuff. And that's why I didn't hit this goal in less than a year. But again, keep in mind, no battlegrounds, no settlements, expedition didn't have the upgrades, all those things. Okay, so how does all of this play out? How do we apply this? Basically, what we're looking at here is if you were the type of player who is just going to collect and spend your city, and you're not going to do a lot of battlegrounds, and you're not going to do a lot of sniping, and you're not going to be plundering your neighbors, which I didn't even add into the potential forge point production. If you're that type of player, the Lord of War approach is going to be better. It's going to get you where you're going faster. If you're the type of proactive player who's doing everything you can at every opportunity, then the FoElite approach is going to get you there faster. How do you apply this? As you are deciding which great buildings to build, obviously we have our recommendations. My approach, the FoElite approach, says avoid the buildings that only give you forge points, or you're only building them to produce more forge points. If you need more population, put in the freaking Inno tower and make the forge points. But you're putting the Inno in for the population, not for the forge points, right? As you are getting special buildings, put in your statues of honor, put in your terrace farms. By all means, it makes sense to do that. And in no way am I recommending avoiding those things. What I'm saying is that when you make your choices on your great buildings, definitely avoid the forge point only. And when you are making choices on which special building to choose at the end, if you can choose one that produces more forge points and one that gives you attack, pick the one that gives attack. That's going to benefit you more in the long run. And then as you develop as a player, you can slowly remove all of those forge point buildings and put in more attack buildings. Does that make sense? That is how I approached it, and that is how the players in my guild have approached it, and it's one of the reasons why we have been so successful. Last distinction is that where you are in the game as a guild also makes a difference. If you are in a guild that is already at the top, right? If you are on what I call a status quo server, which basically means that the top guilds are all basically working together, and you don't have big wars where it takes 20 or 30 or 40 sieges to take a sector, right? You don't need as much. Whereas if you are in a guild that is trying to knock the king of the hill off of the hill, you're going to need every little bit you can get, and that's where my approach really shines. All right, guys, I hope this video has been really helpful to you, and if it has been, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you all later.